An arson attack on a South Korean subway has devastating consequences. Our moment in crime is the Daegu subway fire. His name was Kim Dae-han. He was 56 years old and he lived in the South Korean city of Daegu. A stroke he had in November 2001 cost him his job as a taxi driver and left him partially paralysed. Kim wasn't happy with his medical treatment. The loss of his job and the stroke left him dealing with depression. Dark thoughts began to swirl around his head, but much like Olga Hepnerova, a mass murderer featured in an earlier episode of One Moment in Crime, Kim was becoming angry at the world and felt society was responsible for his current situation. Kim began to plan his suicide, but he didn't want to die alone and he was prepared to take others with him. On the morning of the 18th of February 2003, Kim dressed in a blue tracksuit and left his home. He headed to a gas station where he filled 2 green milk cartons with 7,000 won or $6 worth of gas. Kim then walked to the subway, bought a ticket and boarded the 1079 train on line 1, which was going in the direction of Daegu station. 10 a.m. was quickly approaching. The morning rush hour had almost ended. Most people using the subway at that time were students or young women who worked in the downtown district's department stores, which opened at 10:30 a.m. Many of those people would never make it out of the subway. As the 1079 train left Banwoldang station around 9:53 a.m, Kim began to carry out his plan. Using a cigarette lighter, he began trying to set the milk cartons on fire. When other passengers began to realise what Kim was trying to do, they tried to stop him. But in the struggle, one of the cartons spilled its contents on the floor. As the 1079 train arrived at Jungangno station in downtown Daegu, the gas was set alight. The passengers began to flee, as did Kim, whose back and legs were on fire. It only took 2 minutes for the fire to spread to all 6 cars. Anything that was flammable burned, including the train's insulation, seats and floor, creating thick smoke. The operator of train 1079 failed to tell subway officials about the fire straight away. Then train 1080 pulled into the station. Train 1080's doors opened but quickly shut when the driver saw the fire. It was an attempt to keep out the thick black smoke that was filling the station. Even though subway officials had noticed smoke on the CCTV cameras, they allowed train 1080 to enter the station. Not long after train 1080 arrived at the station, an automatic fire detector shut down the power supply to both trains. Train 1080 would no longer be able to leave the station. Train 1080's driver made 3 announcements, advising passengers to remain seated while he tried to reach his supervisors. He was advised to run and kill the engine. He did just that, but in doing so he removed the master key, causing the onboard batteries to shut down. The train doors would no longer open. The 79 passengers on board had been sealed inside the train. Realising what was happening, the passengers contacted their loved ones. All would lose their lives. By now the platforms and the 3 floors above were burning. The fire reached temperatures of up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. People became trapped in the station because of the smoke. Many died of asphyxiation as they tried to find a way out. Emergency equipment was inadequate. The trains didn't have fire extinguishers, the stations didn't have sprinklers or emergency lighting, and the emergency ventilation systems weren't good enough. Subway workers had little to no training on how to cope with such a situation. No one made any attempts to put out the fire when it started. If they had, lives may have been saved. 1,300 emergency workers responded, but because the fire was so intense, it wasn't extinguished until 1:38 p.m. But the search for the victims couldn't begin straight away. The toxic smoke prevented emergency workers from entering the station for another 3.5 hours. 151 people were injured in the chaos. 8 hospitals admitted the injured, and many would develop respiratory problems and PTSD. But the number of people killed was higher. 192 people lost their lives. Most had been burned beyond recognition. Only DNA analysis would give them their identities back. Eventually, 185 victims were identified. One person was identified by their belongings as their remains hadn't been found. At the time of the 10th anniversary, 6 people still hadn't been identified. An investigation began. Many had wondered why employees had ignored the fire alarm when it went off. It turned out that the fire alarm had malfunctioned 96 times just a couple of months earlier. It's possible that the subway workers thought it was a false alarm. The master key from train 1080 was found in an office at the An Sim train depot. When it was revealed that the driver of 1080 had been in contact with subway officials during the 10 hours after the fire, accusations of a cover-up began to fly. The police then discovered that the transcript of conversations between the driver of 1080 and subway officials had been altered. The altered transcripts were only given to the police after subway officials held 3 meetings. They hid the fact that the driver was told to run and take the master key 10 times. Police believe that the transcript was doctored to put the blame on the driver of train 1080. Train 1080's driver and 6 officials of the Daegu Metropolitan Subway Corporation were arrested, and the head of the corporation was fired. But where was Kim? CCTV cameras had recorded him setting the train on fire, but he wasn't found right away. Then, some of the injured who had been admitted to the Kyungpook National University Hospital informed the police that the arsonist was in the same hospital as them. On the 26th of February, Kim was arrested. The incoming president of South Korea visited a makeshift altar near the destroyed subway station. He was confronted by angry families. Many people across the country were angry that such a disaster had happened. Many felt that South Korea had compromised the safety of its citizens during the country's industrialization. 5 days of mourning was declared by the government, and the incoming president visited the injured. But even though many South Koreans were upset and angry, the country came together to help those affected. 71 billion won, or $65.8 million, was donated. Much of that was used as compensation and medical expenses for victims and their families. The rest was earmarked for the creation of a safety culture foundation that would help those affected. Better safety equipment was promised by subway officials. Spray-on fire-resistant chemicals were added to the interiors of train cars on the Daegu Metropolitan Subway. 6 stations were taken out of service and refurbished by April 2003. Changes were also made all over the country when several subway stations were refurbished in order to improve fire-resistant standards. In August 2003, the driver of train 1080 was sentenced to 5 years in prison for criminal negligence by the Daegu District Court. The driver of train 1079 received a 4-year sentence for the same offence. 2 subway officials received a 3-year sentence for negligent manslaughter, as they had failed to evacuate passengers. 3 other subway officials received suspended jail terms on the same charge. As for Kim himself, he was found guilty of arson and homicide. Prosecutors and some of the victims' families had argued for the death penalty. However, due to the fact that he was mentally ill and remorseful, Kim received a life sentence. Kim began receiving medical treatment in the city of Jinju after being sentenced. On the 31st of August 2004, Kim died in the city's prison. His cause of death is unknown.